Do you remember taking tests in school? When we talk about tests, they serve to verify that you have mastered the skills or knowledge that you're expected to learn. So when you took math tests, those tests were for the purpose of determining whether or not you had learned your multiplication tables, had mastered the skill of algebra or geometry. Yeah, some of us may still struggle with some of that today. Uh, Spelling tests show that you have mastered the skill of being able to properly construct the words and spell the words. That's the whole point of what we think of as tests. They verify whether or not we have mastered the skills. And in doing so, it also shows where we lack, where we need to continue to work. If a child continuously fails in a certain subject, then the teacher knows, hey, I need to work with this student in this regard. They're not understanding the material. They're not understanding the skills. They have not developed it. But then you come to what the Bible talks about, and the Bible talks about tests throughout our lives as well. The Bible talks about numerous people being tested, and also talks about the believer being tested. So why does God test his people? Does God not know where your faith stands? Does God not know what your spiritual condition is, and so he needs to test to try and figure it out? In Hebrews chapter 11, this is, of course, the great hall of faith, as we noted in the previous lesson. But one of the things that the writer of Hebrews does is he goes through and he uses a lot of examples of faith to teach lessons concerning faith. In verse 17 of Hebrews 11, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises and he was offering his unique son, the one it had been said about, your seed will be traced through Isaac. He considered God to be able to raise someone from the dead, and as an illustration, he received him back." So here you have this story of Abraham offering up Isaac, and if you recall the story, or if you're not familiar with the story, basically this is how it worked. Abraham and Sarah had waited decades and decades, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but they had waited a long time for this son of promise, the son that God had promised to give them. And finally, God had given them the son. Isaac had been growing up, he was a young man, and then all of a sudden God says, "Okay, Abraham, I want you to take Isaac down to this specific mountain." It's the mountain that would eventually become the Temple Mount, where Solomon would build the first temple. And God says, "I want you to offer Isaac up as a sacrifice there." Of course, the practice at the time was to offer animal sacrifices. This is the first instance, really, where you find where God would command and demand a human sacrifice. Certainly a strange demand, but Abraham agrees, and he gets Isaac, and they get the wood, they get all the material, they start taking this journey. And Isaac asked the question, we have the wood, we have everything else that we need to offer this sacrifice, Dad. Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham keeps telling God himself will provide a sacrifice. But if you look at the life of Abraham, uh, Abraham was originally from the city of Ur. Ur was in what is modern day Babylon, sat on the Euphrates River, uh, a long ways away from what would become Israel. And God called Abraham to leave there, to take his wife Sarah, to move from there, to move to a land that he had never been to, probably a land that he had never even heard of. And Abraham obeyed. God told him he would make a great nation out of him, but hadn't given him the child, as we noted just a moment ago. it went decades and decades without them having this child. In fact, at one point in time, Abraham and Sarah, they doubted, and they kind of arranged for to try and make it happen, and Abraham ended up having a son uh, with Sarah's handmaiden, and they named him Ishmael. And basically, what you have is you have a series in the life of Abraham, a series of tests. Those are just a couple of the tests in Abraham's life that came up. But his life was full of tests. You go through and you start reading in the book of Genesis, and you start reading about his life, and you'll have a test here and you'll have a test there. You'll have times where Abraham fails the tests, like with Ishmael. You'll have times where he was successful with the tests, like when he leaves Ur. And this brings us to a very, very important point. If you are a Christian, if you know Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, you need to understand that God will test us throughout our spiritual life. As long as you are on this earth, you are going to face tests that are sent from God. It's just a part of the reality that we face. God continuously tests his children. You're going to face it. You may as well accept it. If you think for an instant that God won't test you, you're wrong. Because God tests. He tests his children. But what's interesting is tests are not all the same. See, God wasn't called to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice when Isaac was a little baby. In fact, by the time that God called Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, Isaac was probably somewhere in the neighborhoods, probably in the early 30s. Estimates is usually about 33 years old. So the question comes up, well, why did God wait so long to test Abraham? Well, I think the answer is actually relatively simple, and if you begin to look at Abraham's life, it becomes clear. Look at Abraham and Ishmael. Abraham actually loved Ishmael a great deal. In fact, when Abraham had begged God not to send Ishmael away. In fact, he begged God to make Ishmael the son of promise. He begged God, you promised me this son. Well, why don't you just make it Ishmael? So would God have sacrificed him? So would Abraham have sacrificed Ishmael? Of course not. So why didn't God call for Isaac to be sacrificed as a baby or young child? The answer is really simple, because Abraham wouldn't have done it. If God, when Isaac was 6 weeks old, if God had called Abraham, sacrifice Isaac, Abraham would definitely have said no. You see, God didn't test Abraham so that God could figure out how much faith he possessed. God didn't say, well, I wonder how much Abraham trusts me, so I'm going to offer him this test of offering Isaac as a sacrifice. That's not what happened. God already knew how much faith Abraham possessed. God didn't ask Abraham earlier to offer Isaac as a sacrifice because Abraham didn't possess the faith to obey. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, we read this: "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humanity. God is faithful, and he will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way of escape so that you are able to bear it." Now, you might be looking at that and say, well, that says temptation, not testing. And there is a subtle difference. Sometimes there's no difference. Sometimes temptations exist as a form of testing. But the principle is still the same. God knows what our spiritual condition is. God knows where we stand. And so God does not push us beyond what we are able to deal with. He doesn't test us beyond what our faith is capable of accepting. You see, but what God does do is He will test us to show us where our faith stands. Not so that He understands where our faith stands, so that we understand where our faith stands. You see, our perceptions of our spiritual condition is not always accurate. Sometimes we can easily overestimate how spiritual we are. We can think that we are far more spiritually and inclined and attuned to God than what we really are. Sometimes we underestimate. Sometimes we see ourselves how we used to be, and we fail to recognize just how far God has actually brought us. But when God tests us, it reveals the true state of our faith, and it shows us where we need to grow. Again, to go back to that illustration that we started with of you in school taking the tests, those tests showed whether or not you had mastered the skills or whether or not you needed more work in said skills. That's part of why God tests us, not so that God understands, so that we can understand. It's not that we are incapable, that our faith is incapable of meeting the test, but sometimes the tests can be very difficult. Sometimes they can be very severe. Sometimes they show us exactly where our faith stands and where we need to grow. And so this brings us to this very important question of how does our faith grow? We noted in the previous lesson that faith is a spiritual muscle. And just like physical muscles require exercise to grow, if a person never does anything but sits on the couch watching television, they are going to physically become very, very weak. Their body is going to become atrophied. But if they go to the gym, if they exercise, if they run, if they work out, they will become stronger and stronger and stronger. Those muscles will build up. They will grow in size. A bodybuilder becomes a bodybuilder because he exercises, he works to develop those muscles. Faith works in the exact same way. It grows through exercise. It grows through use. If you go back up a few verses in Hebrews 11, back in verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed and went out to a place he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going." Abraham's faith was first tested when he was called to move. God says, "Abraham, I want you to go to this place. You've never been there. You've never heard of it. You're not even sure exactly where it is that I'm leading you, but trust me and move." Now, while Abraham didn't know ultimately where he was going to end up, to a certain extent, the call of God was not too terribly extreme. And what I mean by that is this. Most of us have moved at some point in time in our life. You listening to this right now, you've made a move. You packed up and you've moved. We understand moving. We understand how it's done. We understand how it's operating. If God called you and said, "Hey, I want you to get up and I want you to move to this city that you've never been to before," yes, it might be challenging, but it's not extreme. It's not God saying, "I want you to sacrifice your firstborn son." Renting a U-Haul is not as an extreme a test as what Abraham would eventually face. And you go down to verse number 11 there in Hebrews 11. It says, "By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have a child, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as numerable as the sands by the seashore." So you have this further test where the faith of Abraham and Sarah, it was tested by having to wait on God for a promised son. Now the reality, and most of us understand this, is that patience can be incredibly difficult. Sometimes waiting for a few days, waiting for a few hours, when something happens, when you have a scare in your life and you're waiting to hear back from a doctor or something like that, it can be very, very tense, and that time of patience can be incredibly difficult. But imagine waiting for years, waiting for decades. And for Abraham and Sarah, this test was far more severe, and it became far more challenging because by the time, they both long past the age of people having children. That's what it means when it says, therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead. Basically, what it's saying is Abraham was well past the age of having children. He should not have he should not have been able to have any children at that point in time. Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was 100. And after decades of waiting, God finally gave them the son that he had promised. See, when you begin to look at it from this perspective, that first test of pack up the U-Haul and move, that was not, by most estimations, too terribly severe. God saying, I'm going to give you a promised son, but you have to wait for him. You're going to have to wait decades. That becomes more problematic. And in many other cases, the testing of Abraham and Sarah becomes far more challenging. But you see, each successive step proved to be a greater challenge than the last. And that brings us to this important reality concerning testing. When God tests, he tests to grow our faith. God uses this testing to grow our faith. Your faith is developed and it's grown by the test that God gives. So yes, when God tests, he does so to reveal our strengths and reveal our weaknesses, to show us where we are, and shows us where we need to work, where we need to strive, where we need to learn to trust him more, and where our faith needs to grow. But he also uses it to grow our faith. And here is basically how faith grows. It starts off with God calling us to do something that we believe to be beyond ourselves. In fact, Henry Blackaby, in his book Experiencing God, notes that one of the ways you can understand the voice of God, you can recognize that it is God calling you to do something, is when you look at the call and you say, this is too big for me. Because God does not call us to do things that are easily within our power, easily within our grasp. God calls us to do things that require us to trust him and to have faith in him. And so this first step is God calls us to do what we believe to be beyond ourselves, or is beyond our norm, or is beyond our thinking. Something that says, I have to trust God. He starts with Abraham and Sarah. He says, pack up and move to a place you've never been. Yes, it's not severe, it's not necessarily over the top testing, but it is a challenge. It's difficult. Do you really trust God to lead you safely to this place that you've never been to? You don't know where it is, you don't know you've never even heard of it. You trust God. But when we act in obedience to what God calls us to do, God provides what is needed to accomplish his call. That's the second step. That's the second part. So number one, God calls us to do what we believe that is beyond ourselves. Number two, God provides what is needed to accomplish his call. Heard just a couple weeks ago, Charles Stanley was talking about this issue of faith. He was in an interview, and he was actually being interviewed by his son Andy, and he made this amazing statement. He said that when God calls us to do something, it becomes God's responsibility to provide what is needed for us to accomplish his calling. And that's part of this aspect of faith growing, is God coming in. Yes, we feel inadequate. Yes, we don't know. We don't know where this place is. We don't know where it is that God is leading us to. But God provides what is necessary to accomplish his call. And number 3, our understanding of what is possible expands and our faith grows. So, after God provides, what we thought was impossible, what we thought was too big for me, what we thought was too great, God takes care of through us. And we understand, you know what? God could be trusted in this way. And so for the next step, I can trust him again. Our faith grows a little bit more. And so the next time that God calls us to do something, it is beyond our new understanding of what is possible, and it is beyond what our new understanding of who God is. And so he calls us out to take another step. He provides, our faith grows. Then he calls us to take another step. He provides, our faith grows. This is how you move from God calling Abraham and Sarah to make a move to Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son. The rest of the story of Abraham and Isaac is very interesting. They get to the mountain. Abraham climbs up the mountain. He binds up Isaac, lays Isaac out on the wood that they've prepared to be the sacrifice. He raises the knife. He is fully prepared to trust God. And what it says here in Hebrews is he believed so much, he trusted God so much that it didn't matter if Isaac died. He believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead if necessary, because he had learned that God was going to do exactly what he said he would do. And God stopped Abraham. He says, okay, Abraham, you've proven faithful. You've proven that you have trusted me. Now look right over there. And there was a ram whose horns were caught in a bush. God said, there's the sacrifice. But you see, had Abraham refused, when God called Abraham to offer up Isaac, if Abraham had said, no way, God, I can't do it, this is my son, he never would have seen God provide the ram. And you see, oftentimes what happens is in that first step when God calls us to do something that we believe beyond ourselves, our initial reaction is to say no. God, that's too big. But what if? And we start listing out all of the questions. What if you don't provide? What if this doesn't happen? What if this doesn't work, God? And all the while, God is saying, just trust me. Do what I say. And the test is working for our benefit. It's working to grow us and to develop us. And if we resist at step 1, then we miss out on what God will do in step 2. And in step 3, we fail to grow. And so here is where I want you to kind of look for a moment and look at your own personal life. Are you going through a time of testing? Are you going through that hardship? Or has God called you to do something? Are you going through that temptation? Are you facing that hardship and that challenge right now? And you're saying, God, I can't do this. Are you resisting God's work to grow your faith? Because if you are, you're missing out. You're missing out on understanding how big and how great and how faithful God Himself is towards us. And you are missing out on the opportunity to grow and to develop your own faith. So ask yourself the question, am I resisting God's work to grow my faith right now.